Rebellion, Chapter 7, 13. It had been Laner who'd had the sense to arrange a further meeting about setting up a satellite campus on Dragonstone and access to the book. I'd been too busy trying to set my feelings in order. In order to create black powder in sufficient quantities, I would need to wade through a literal river of blood. I would burn through any reputation I developed. It would be worse than original Renora, worse than Mager even. I blinked in the afternoon light as Laner steered me into the litter. I felt numb. What kind of bullshit logic did this place operate on? All this talk about ancient tablets, the long night and blood magic was taking a second seat to the fact that even when the first round of testing had not worked, I'd still assumed I'd get the black powder somehow. That I'd still have guns and that all the politics could be avoided with a superior show of firepower. When the litter stopped, we were not at the Red Keep but the Dragon Pit. At my questioning look, Laner smiled and placed a warm hand over my cool one. You looked upset. I figured we could make a start on that promise to fly together, he said, with a reassuring smile. Thank you. Anne. Thank you for sorting things out with wisdom, Jarrett. I had to fight a wince at my tone. I sounded exhausted. I felt exhausted. I wanted nothing more than to fly to Dragonstone, curl up in my bed and weep at how unfair it all was. He held me close for a few moments and I tried not to care about that jolt of wrongness. The flight on Syrax cheered me up. The feeling of freedom that being a princess tended to strangle. I raced Laner several times and won most of them. I watched as Syrax skimmed over the bay, skimming her claws through the water. After a while, our flight descended into playing the dragon's version of tag, in which we took it in turns to see if we could deliver gentle nips to the other's tail. As Sea Smoke and Syrax danced over the waves, we caught sight of the vast bulk of Vagr flying alongside two ships. One bore a Valerian banner and the other Targaryen one. Together, Laner and I moved in, circling Vagr. She was not a fast beast and our playful flitting back forth certainly got a rise out of her rider if the yelling was any indication. I felt better by the time we had all landed and the dragons moved into Dragon Pit. Less like the world had ended, but I still felt fragile, as if any little thing could shatter me. I couldn't afford to shatter in King's Landing. I happily sank into Lena's hug before moving away and laughing as Laner ruffled his sister's immaculate ringlets and she slapped at his hands in mock annoyance. So, I hear you were on the wrong end of father recently, Lena mentioned as we clambered into the litter. Laner groaned and Lena laughed. She was in an odd position when it came to her father. She was the second half of his grand plan to cement his legacy. Beautiful, wealthy and equipped with a dragon, Corlys had sought marry his daughter to my father, the king, because aim high I guess. When he failed, he'd used her to secure Bravo's support in his upcoming conquest. A marriage to the then Sea Lord's son with the understanding he would have the prestige of a dragon rider for a wife, the sea snake's incredible wealth and the subtle pressure of his wife's family controlling shipping in the narrow sea via the stepstones backing him to succeed his father when he died. But the Sea Lord of Bravos died early and Taikio Harshios had proved an utter wastrel. He'd quickly squandered his father's money after his death by making several appallingly bad investments. Investments that had actually managed to damage his family name by sheer association. Apparently the Bravosi nobles saw lack of financial acumen as major turn-off, much as one dishonorable family member could tank a Westerosi house for generations, I supposed. By the time Lena was eligible to marry, he'd been a penniless scion of a declining house. Corlys' pride would not allow him to marry his daughter to such a man, but a lot of the upfront money for the conquest had been Harshios' money. The Iron Bank themselves were involved when the contract was written and the contract stated she was to marry him. So Corlys came up with excuse after excuse as to why the wedding couldn't happen yet, whilst plying Taikio with wine and women in the hope the fool would get himself killed. No wonder he'd jumped on Daemon marrying Lena in the original timeline. In fact, I'd take a bet that Corlys had asked Daemon to rid him of the stupid boy in the process. Just mentioning his name would have Corlys grinding his teeth, a fact I can assure you I did not take advantage of. The odd intersection of the deadlock on the marriage front, the massive dragon and Lena's own personality meant her father was completely unsure of how to deal with her and so solved his problem by not dealing with her at all. As far as I could tell, as long as he was unable to incorporate her into his ongoing plans to strengthen House Valerian, he liked to pretend she didn't exist. Rhaenyra dared have an original idea, said Laner dryly, sending Lena into peals of laughter. He took it as well as expected. That just made Lena laugh harder. He blundered though. Now I know he has men on Dragonstone, I intend to send them back to him via Driftmark, I said lightly. Laner frowned, likely realizing that I was referring to Joffrey. No doubt he was worrying about the knight being in danger. Corlys was basically a more restrained Tywin, I'd come to realize. He would not strike at me for the insult, but Joffrey had no such protection. Oh, I would pay to see father's face when he gets that note from mother. Probably along with her commentary as well. Damn you, you thick-headed fool. Lena's excellent impression of her mother had me chuckling as well as Laenor guffawing. The ride back was spent with the two siblings making increasingly more ridiculous impressions of their parents. The horror of my earlier discovery seemed so far away, but before I could let myself make plans for the future, I had to live through a meal with Harwin and Larys. Before that, we had to show our faces at court. Viserys greeted Lena warmly and Laenor and I chatted with Lord Hayford and one of the Rosbys. Both houses were blacks through and through, but it was always a good idea to reinforce that loyalty. In addition, Laenor had managed to arrange a sit-down meeting with Lord Wendwater through his nephew by discussing timber shipments. Today would not be a total loss then. Lord Wendwater was a hesitant green. Given the complete lack of knowledge about where the young, impetuous Boros Baratheon would jump, he was right to be hesitant. The Stormlands bordered Lord Wendwater's lands and would make a juicy target should the Stormlands declare for a different claimant. I had been hoping to start on the other side of the Crownlands in Cracklaw Point, but those lords rarely came to court. I spent the rest of the session tracking down and persuading the black-leaning Lord Celtigar to help me with the matter. Lena left us late on so that we could prepare to meet the Strongs. Laenor thought it important we coordinated in order to subtly reinforce the fact Harwin had no chance with me, just in case he was still harboring any mistaken thoughts. Which meant I got to try on a whole bunch of dresses, much to my internal glee. The current court style was heavily influenced by the Reach, not one I could imitate for obvious reasons, so finding a fashionable solution to that dilemma was always fun. I had adopted a veil-influenced wardrobe, for the most part. The long swishy dresses that accentuated the figure usually accompanied by an equally swishy mantle that could be made to evoke wings, useful for falcons and dragons. Whereas most of the veil dresses were woolen, I favored much richer fabrics. I did not need the dresses to last, nor did I need them to keep me warm. I opted for black and teal color scheme, evoking mine and Laenor's houses. Laenor had little interest in fashion, like most Westerosi lords he liked to be seen as above it, but he trusted me when it came to saying it with clothes and figuring out what others were saying with their style of dress, so I didn't have to sweat the back of his head too much as I ordered the servants to lay out his outfit. It had been a good idea to start preparing early as it turned out, we'd barely gotten ourselves dressed when Larys and Harwin arrived. Harwin was a gorgeous man. Tall, muscled and with a face that could melt any maiden's heart and bearing that distinctive nose that would be as good as a smoking gun if I gave in to the temptation, it really was not hard to see why Rhaenyra had risked everything to be with him. Larys, on the other hand, was everything his brother was not. He walked with a limp due to his twisted foot, his face could charitably be described as interesting when he smiled, which was not a regular occurrence, and he had a peculiar, intense way of looking at you that gave you the impression he was trying to imagine you without clothes on. Given a choice, I'd take a talk with Larys over Harwin any day. He was breathtakingly intelligent and whilst shy, when he did speak it was always worth paying attention to him. Harwin on the other hand was quite willing to blather out every single thought that entered his fool head, and I can assure you, very little of his thoughts were worth the energy it took to have them. As much as Larys was the complete opposite of a Westerosi lord, Harwin was the epitome of one. Sorry we're early, Your Grace. It's difficult to time things with Limpy here. The shove that accompanied the comment nearly sent Larys sprawling, but the smaller man recovered. Larys' face did not move from its usual scowl, but his eyes were full of hate. If Harwin wasn't even making the effort to rein in his usual Westerosi dickishness, tonight was not going to be fun. It's not a problem, Ser Strong. Larys is a friend and I'm always willing to make accommodations for my friends. I aimed a bright smile at the clubfoot but failed to coax one in return. I took his arm and guided him to the table, sitting him next to me if only to serve as a barrier against Harwin's ongoing inane chatter. If the start of the meal was awkward, it only became more so as time went on. Harwin alternated between taking cheap shots at his brother, shamelessly flirting with me, drinking enough wine to kill a horse and implying that Laenor was gay or possibly a woman in disguise. Some of his insults were a bit indistinct. Larys kept quiet, only speaking to correct his brother's more outrageous claims and to ask how Ser Joffrey had recovered from the accident at my wedding tourney. He seemed happy to learn that Joffrey was up and about, finding ways to make himself useful. Both I and Laenor were wondering when Larys had even befriended Joffrey. I resolved to ask him about it next time I saw him. Finally, as we finished up dessert, I broached the topic I had invited them for. I must admit I had an alternative motive for inviting you tonight, I said, as the servants cleared the table. Harwin perked up like a dog at the sound of the treat packet being opened, but Laris merely nodded as if he'd completely expected this. Do you require our support in some kind scheme? Asked Harwin, eagerly. I forced myself not to grimace. If I ever wanted to shame, it'd be Laris I'd choose. How Harwin had not given the game away himself in the original timeline was probably considered a minor miracle by some religions. No, nothing like that, Sir Strong. Laner butted in, hastily. You are aware of course that until she was 4 my lady wife lived in the Tower of the Hand? Harwin looked puzzled as if that had never occurred to him before, but Laris merely nodded for him to continue. As a child I was fond of exploring the tunnels in the tower. I fear they are littered with old possessions of mine. I was wondering if you would allow me access so that I could reclaim them. Tunnels? I was unaware of this, Laris responded before Harwin could even open his mouth. Regardless, I'd be happy to accompany you, Harwin quickly said, cutting off anything else his brother could say. It was what I had expected, but luckily Laner had come up with several excuses to lure the older strong brother into staying with him. Harwin had little argument and was forced to sit there like a big, dumb puppy that knew it had done something wrong but couldn't quite figure out what as Laris limped his way out the door as I followed. The Tower of the Hand was much changed since it had been Prince Balin's place of residence. Unsurprising, I suppose, as it had seen 2 hands since. I only realized I stopped in the entranceway when Laris limped up behind me. Is everything well, Your Grace? He asked quietly, interrupting my mind as it began recreating the tower as it had been when I'd first awoken as Renera. Apologies, Laris. It has changed so much. He nodded but didn't elaborate further. We made our way inside. Lionel's household didn't seem to be in a rush to bother us, but I'd bet they'd be eager to report my presence in the tower to their master the moment they could. I didn't bother making a show about remembering the entrance location. If it had been Harwin it would have worked, but behaving like a ditzy woman around Laris was pointless. He'd just see through it, and even if he didn't, he wasn't given to the pandering most men were all too willing to engage in around me. The tunnels were as dusty and gloomy as I remembered. My little collection had been stored in an alcove further in, and I was proud that it only took 1 or 2 wrong turns before I located the stash. Laris' head seemed to be on a swivel, his eyes wide as he took in the surprisingly extensive tunnel system. All I can say is Mager definitely didn't trust his hands. There wasn't a single room in the tower you couldn't eavesdrop on from the tunnels. The book was there, covered in grime and dust, but other than that it looked undamaged. Well, book was an exaggeration really, it was a loose collection of paper I was telling everyone was copied from a book. It was the other items of the stash that took me completely off guard though. Gently, as if it might collapse at the touch, I lifted up the blue fabric of the blanket. As I realized just what it was, emotion I wasn't prepared for punched me in the gut. I suppose this was just going to be one of those days, and so I resigned myself to the storm of regret. I had forgotten this was here. I thought it lost, I choked and then realized I was crying. Behind me, Laris shifted uncomfortably. I turned the blanket over, obscured by dust, but right where I remembered, the silver falcon and moon of the Aarons. Oh, I had not wanted to love Emma Aaron. The Renera in me had forced me to, but I hadn't wanted to. The day she'd announced her pregnancy had been awful, I'd wept so much because I'd known. Emma had assured me that a new child would not make her love me any less, and I couldn't. I couldn't tell her what was coming. She'd been desperate for a boy. Runsider had given the okay to get pregnant again, but she'd died. Died because Viserys had married her when she'd been 11 and by 13 she'd already given birth. A brother that had died before his first name day. It had ruined her health, ruined her body. Viserys should have known. Runsider should have known. They still kept pushing, for them a male heir was more important than a living wife. I'd come along and the effort alone had nearly killed her. She'd been 15 and bed-bound for months afterwards. Viserys hadn't given up. He'd kept pushing and only miscarriages had followed. Until the babe she carried hadn't died in the womb like the rest. Until the birth killed her. What had Viserys been thinking? I knew the answer to that. He hadn't. Stupid, stupid bastard. 7 months wasn't enough to say goodbye to your mother. Laris was awkwardly patting me on the back and I realized I was sobbing. I must have been doing it for some time if Laris had been moved enough to try his own brand of comforting. I dashed the tears from my eyes and gathered everything for the pages to a cracked picture. My apologies, Laris. Old memories. I hated how thick my voice sounded. I quite understand. My own mother died in the child bed. His voice was quiet. Do you fear it? The question took me by surprise. It was considered a woman's duty to marry and birth heirs above anything else. To ask a woman if she feared the child bed was like asking a man if he feared battle. Fighting words to the Westerosi. Oh, but I did fear childbirth. Men would not understand, and the only older female figure in my life was Alicent. I feared the child bed so badly that when I thought of it, in the dead of night, I was in danger of sending myself into spirals of panic. Breath coming short, head spinning, all for nothing because no matter how I twisted and turned I simply could not get away with not having children. I would be a fool not to. Both my grandmothers died in childbirth, my mother died in childbirth. My voice was wavering at the thought of it. But I will do my duty when the time comes as they did before me. I have no doubt you will, Your Grace. If I may offer some advice though. Most maesters do not study childbirth overly much. Make sure yours is prepared. I didn't have time to delve into that comment because we emerged from the hatch to find Lord Strong and Viserys waiting for us. It wasn't the two most powerful in the Seven Kingdoms that set my stomach rolling though, it was the man that flanked them. Ser Criston Cole. I suppose I couldn't avoid him forever, he was still the Lord Commander of the Kingsguard. Someone up there really hates me though. This hasn't been the worst day I've had in Westeros, but by gods, it's definitely in the running. Lord Strong studied me for a moment and then barked out an order for something clean myself with. I was ditched, covered in grime and dust with clear tear tracks on my face. I must have looked a state. You went into the tunnels unguarded, said the king. I examined him, trying to get an idea of which mood he was in tonight. He wasn't angry, not truly, he seemed more annoyed. Unfortunately for him, I'd been reminded of his shortcomings recently, so I was definitely not going to roll over and accept being reprimanded by him for something he had no right to stick his nose into. It was hardly a risk. None of the tunnels lead outside the keep and it was important, I sneered back. I shouldn't provoke him, but I was tired. Today had been far too much and my emotions had been stretched to the breaking point. He scowled at me before focusing on the bundle I held. It's the blanket Mother gave me, I answered before he could query it. At my answer, the irritation left him and instead he smiled indulgently. Ah. It makes more sense now. You want it for your own babe, he said as a maid bustled in with the water. I hadn't even remembered it was there, but now that I thought about it, it was a nice idea. I nodded as I used the water to clean myself up. Well, I can't argue with that. Does this mean you're pregnant? Ser Criston stiffened at his words. Oh great, don't ask how I'm doing ruling Dragonstone or whether I have opinions on roads. Those things aren't important to being queen, it's all about how many babies you can shoot out and whether they have the correct hair color. I will be queen, not Laener's broodmare. Whoops, dial it back and answer the man. No, father. I intend to wait for a year or two, I told him. He frowned, anger evident on his features. It is your duty dash. I understand my duty well, father, but might I remind you of how your own mother died? My mother. Her mother. Even Queen Alysanne lost babes. I snapped. He took a deep breath to retort, but I held up a hand. I am exhausted and wish to return to my rooms. That really wasn't a lie, but I doubt Laenor would let me sleep before we'd flick through the pages together. Of course, daughter. Ser Criston, please escort the princess back her rooms. Ouch, okay, I had that coming. Yelling at a king was not cool and all that, but you really have to rub it in, Viserys. The Lord Commander of the Kingsguard was silent as we made out way back. From the way his jaw was clenched, he was angry. No doubt Alicent would receive a report of tonight's events. I nearly crashed into him when he stopped. Laris Strong? He asked, finally. What are you talking about? I asked. He spun around to face me. You'll fuck Laris Strong, but you will not have me, he hissed. His hands were flexing around the hilt of his sword. I did not like where this was going. When Prince Daemon nearly killed you, I defended you. I fought for you. You would take that disgusting boy lover and the fucking clubfoot over me. You defended me, yes. You did your duty as a Kingsguard. Care to remember what else to Oath of the Kingsguard commands? As for Laris, I did not fuck him. You know I did not. I am loyal to my husband. To Laenor Velaryon. Not to Daemon Targaryen. Not to Harwin or Larry Strong. And certainly not to you. And if you insult my husband in such a manner again, I will have you killed. The arctic tone of my voice caused him to stiffen, his hand clenched tightly around the hilt of his sword, his face turned to a mottled white of pure fury. Whore, he hissed. If I am whore, Kristen, what does it say about you that I will not have you? I was saved from his ire and rage by Harwin and one of the Cargill twins rounding the corner and talking loudly. No doubt they saw my furious expression and Kristen pulling back from me like a child with his hand in the cookie jar. The two newcomers paused. Ser Cargill, Harwin. Returning to the Tower of the Hand? I asked. Harwin was quick to tell me that his father had dispatched Ser Cargill to fetch him, but the knight in question was keeping a cool eye on Ser Kristen. No doubt Viserys would receive the report we had argued and promptly dismiss it like every report of Kristen's behavior in regards to me and Alicent. Thank you for escorting me this far, Ser Cole. I slipped by him before he could insist on walking me the entire way. Good night, Ser Eric, Ser Harwin. Laenor was still in my rooms when I returned, pacing up and down in some amount of agitation. Oh, are you well? The king is apparently in a fine temper to learn you've been messing with the Strongs. I put my bundle down on the table we had eaten on not so long ago. I set him straight, I replied, neglecting to mention our spat. Gods, what the hell went off in that man's head? To name his daughter heir but then screw her over in every other conceivable way. If you hate me, why make me heir? If you want me dead, why not just have me killed? My head span and I grimaced. I couldn't take any more of this yo-yoing. If every day in King's Landing was this exciting, I'm going to give serious thought to moving to Ib or something. You told him about the book? Laenor asked, eyes wide. I shook my head and unfolded the blanket, grimacing at the state it was in. Laenor moved over, quickly collecting the pages before stopping to give a puzzled look at the rest of the items. Is that the wooden sword you stole from me at the Great Council? He sounded dumbfounded, even as I smiled. You lost it in a bet, I replied, and he huffed before chuckling himself. The blanket belonged to my mother and her mother before her. I intend to get it restored and give it to our child. A reassuring hand rubbed between my shoulder blades and he didn't even tense up this time. Laenor put the pages aside. Apart from his sword, the pages, and the blanket itself, nothing really had any sentimental value. One of the maids was summoned to take the blanket away for cleaning and Laenor quickly hid his old toy from its original thief. He declared it his own heirloom. Then it was time to get to business. We split the pages and read through them. I'd managed to get the agriculture ones, the ones that described selective breeding, crop rotation, farming machinery and food preservation. I'd also managed to get half of the notes on distillation. It was clear from my confused rambling I hadn't really gotten the concept of farming. For example, I'd made mention of a plow, but there were no descriptions on how it would help, its purpose, or even how it differed from normal farming techniques. I dutifully wrote down a summary from what I could understand and glanced at Laenor. He was rigid in his seat, eyes flickering back and forth with excitement written large on his face. That probably wasn't good. Rhaenyra. Look at this. If it's right, this could change everything. He slid a page yellowed with time across to me and I picked it up. I'd gotten halfway through talking about mold when I realized what this entailed. Penicillin. I glanced back at Laenor, who looked as if he was barely stopping himself from bouncing in his chair. Would penicillin even work? Gunpowder had not. If it did, the possibilities were endless, but the question was whether the spore even existed in Westeros. A medicine that can treat a massive range of illnesses. A near cure-all, he squeaked. And look here. A section on birthing. Another paper was slid across. In a past life, my sister had been a midwife. For all that the concept of birth terrified me, I'd still been eager to listen to the stories told. Here's a fun fact about midwifery: forceps are really useful for preventing unnecessary deaths in childbirth. In our world, they'd been invented by this one guy who'd kept them a secret, going so far as to blindfold mothers during birth so no one would find out his trick. And then his family had done the same thing for the next 150 years. I suddenly wanted to throw up. Could this have saved my mother's life? As if reading my thoughts, Laenor laid a hand on mine. You were a child. Even if you had shown Runsider, he wouldn't have listened, he said kindly, before pulling free another page. Look at this one. A simple device for amplifying sound. Simple. Yet not one maester has ever thought to use something like this. I left him to his discoveries and summoned a maid to help me prepare for bed. I fell asleep soon after to Laner's exclamations of excitement and frantic scribbling from the other room. When I awoke and staggered out of bed regretting all my life choices, Laner was still in the same place he'd been the night before, paper littering the table and floor around him. He waved me over and I collapsed into a chair opposite him. Mornings were hard. A maid hurried over and presented me with a cup of juice and some fruit, one of mine that arrived yesterday. I thanked her before turning my attention back to my husband, who was sorting the paper explosion into some kind of order. I've managed to create a system in which the papers are filed into general groups. A few of the big ones are agriculture, medicine, and oddly enough glass. Whoever wrote this really had a high opinion of glass, he told me. Sue me, it's super useful for everything and it's a travesty we all just accept Mir makes the best glass. From there I've ordered them into how much detail the text goes into producing the technology. I think we can start work on the agricultural technologies on Dragonstone and Driftmark this year even. You wish to start on Dragonstone and Driftmark? Why not the Crownlands? We need to start gathering and strengthening allies as soon as possible, I asked, ignoring the slightly wild look in his eyes. He'd definitely not slept. His doublet was creased, his eyes dark and his hair an unbound mess. I resisted the urge to comb my hands through it, he wouldn't appreciate it. He got defensive when it came to his hair. Have you ever worked with farmers? I shook my head. My duties at Dragonstone mostly brought me into contact with the small-time merchants in the port. Well, they're stubborn. Very stubborn. Not they don't have good reason, if they all try something new and they all fail then they do not eat and neither does anyone else. The section on farming machinery is very vague and will probably require the help of the wisdoms producing anything from it, but the idea of actively breeding plants and animals for traits? We do that already but just not on the scale the book describes in necessary for fast change. The field system suggested, although I admit I've never heard of Norfolk, could be implemented across the islands within a year. 2 at most. Its underlying theory could spawn more technology the writer of this book couldn't dream of. And once we prove it works, we'll be hip deep in lords wanting to know how we did it. I said slowly, unable to stop the cat-like smile of satisfaction growing across my face. He nodded along, I bright now that I'd finally gotten it. I eyed his other stacks and had an idea. Laner, have you looked any more into the section on birthing? I asked. He nodded and tapped a stack of pages, I recognized some of the terms. Had he seriously copied everything? I scooped a few of the pages up and found that yes, he had copied the entire thing by hand. He'd even tried producing sketches of the things I'd described. Some of them were remarkably close and some, well, they could use work. Laurie said yesterday that his mother died in childbirth. I said slowly. Have you any relatives who? Well, father hardly likes to tell everyone but my birth ended mother's chances of another child. She struggled with Lena as well. It was an awkward subject. Septons and septas liked to wax lyrical about the miracle of birth and how the birthing bed was a woman's ultimate duty, but no one liked to acknowledge how dangerous it was, how often women died or lost their children. Laurie said that most maesters do not overly study childbirth. Laner snorted in response. Maesters study everything, he replied, but my brain was spinning now. Taking what I knew of Westeros and of the maesters and of how nearly every family in every generation had a tale of someone dying needlessly and comparing with vague memories of a sister who'd studied for years to be a midwife, who'd still not been allowed to do solo births until she had assisted others and had proven experience. Unbidden, my mind drifted to the doddering Runsider and the sneering Melos and even my own Gerardis. In truth, I had never been fond of the maesters. Runsider had merely turned that dislike into a hardened idea to do something about them in the distant future. I thought about Westeros' idea of midwives. Midwives were a tradition of the small folk and were usually older women who'd gotten the role through experience than study. It was sort of assumed anyone who was anyone had a maester. If you were having to consult midwives and healers then you were as good as saying you didn't have the money or prestige for one of Westeros' Knights of the Mind. That's right. They do. How could any man truly know a subject if he spends half a year studying at best? I asked, slowly. After all, doctors studied for years and still had to jump through hoops to practice. Was this why so many died? Not malice or some conspiracy but simple mistakes made by men who'd never assisted in birth before. After all, the maesters served a castle. They didn't attend the birth of every pregnant woman in a 10-mile radius. They might, if that woman was lucky, help with a favored servant. Helping anyone who asked would damage their exclusivity, of course. People might start associating maesters with, gasp, the small folk. Laner was looking at me strangely. Think about it. How many times do you think Maester Gerardis has assisted in a birth? And he has several silver links. Now Laner looked thoughtful, probably because he knew the answer was 0. You believe that the inexperience of the maesters is what kills their patients? He asked slowly. I nodded eagerly. Yes. We have access to a set of ideas that could revolutionize medicine. We could create an entirely new set of healers, ones who study only the art of healing and may even specialize further into diseases or birthing. Laner stroked his chin, but his mouth was twisted, as if he were wrestling with his thoughts and losing. The maesters have always been Westeros healers. They have access to knowledge built up over centuries. Even if what is contained in the book is enough to challenge their supremacy, we'd need a massive investment to do so, he pointed out, tone doubtful. Push back. I've presented something new too fast and it's straining his Westerosi worldview. After all, better farming is fine, but knocking out a major pillar of the maester's power? Questioning a system that's been in use for thousands of years. Please, Laner, any of this technology is unlikely to make the maesters happy. Take the press for example. They make their money off of controlling access to books, deciding which books are copied and which are not. We could print any book 100 times over for a fraction of the cost and in a fraction of the time. His face screwed up, a lifetime of socialization telling him that this would not work. It's much too far, much too fast. We're trying to win you a throne, not take Westeros apart and put it back together again in a new order, he pointed out finally. Damn him, he had a point. All but declaring war on the maesters would likely scare a lot lords on principle alone. To say nothing of whose ears the maesters themselves would start whispering in. For now we can focus on the farming and getting the wisdoms to Dragonstone, but Laner, I want to train midwives as well. That is not negotiable. Laner studied me for a few moments after that announcement. I finished the last of the fruit, ignoring his silent condemnation. I was not going to risk dying in a childbirth any more than I needed to, and if we could prove they worked, that they were better than maesters, well, Westerosi lords would clamor for them. It would be the first crack in their dominance over Westeros. Very well. I'll add it to the instructions I send to Dragonstone. I watched as he pulled a sheet free and jotted down a few lines. I drank my juice and listened to the sound of his scribbling, allowing my eyes to drift closed. I'm sending Lena to Dragonstone with all of this. She should be able to make a round trip in a day if she pushes Vagor a little. Then I'm going to see Wisdom Jarrett so he can start getting a selection of alchemists to Dragonstone, he told me, rising from his seat. Perhaps you should change first. I asked, nodding at his less than appropriate attire. He pulled a face. You know certain people will have a field day if they see you sprinting around the city looking like that. You're right. It's just. Rhaenyra, I have been trained to take the lordship of an island. My knowledge is trade, as shameful as most will find that, and even I can see that there isn't a single technology in here that won't improve lives across all of Westeros. He ran an agitated hand through his hair. I let him leave with the promise he'd at least bathe before speaking with Wisdom Jarrett and not give away too much of the technology contained within its pages until the guild was under our thumb and indebted to us. I sipped the last of my juice and leant back in my chair. Was I making a mistake? Even if I was wrong, it was too late now. Laner had seen the pages. He knew that they were invaluable in more ways than money it would bring us. Used correctly, they would secure Targaryen and Valyrian dominance for centuries to come. There would be no gradual decline as the family desperately tried to command unruly vassals, no civil wars that our opponents had any hope to win. Considering the general quality of Targaryen rulers going forward, that's going to be a problem. On that horrifying thought I forced myself to rise, calling my maids to me. I had errands to run before a meeting with Lord Wendwater and then a meeting with Lord Celtigar. I would need to impress both if my work to sway the Crownlands was to make a good start. I couldn't rely on just the Crownlands though. So after I had changed and bathed, I sat down and wrote to my cousin. I had last seen Jane at my wedding. She'd seemed cheerful and friendly enough, at least when the swarms of potential suitors weren't present, but I hadn't been thinking politically then. I'd had visions of professional soldiers armed with muskets dancing before my eyes. I hadn't bothered playing politics because I hadn't thought I needed to. In retrospect, even had the black powder been viable, that had been a mistake. So I was sure to remain warm but diplomatic, without assuming too much about how much leeway our shared blood would buy me. I inquired about her health, how the veil was, whether she had her eye on any suitors, and finally, whether she'd allow me to visit in the near future. The letter was too long and heavy to send by Raven, so I paid for a courier to get it to Jane post-haste, which gave me another idea. If I was going to damage the maesters as healers and archivists, why not damage their hold on communications too? The days turned into weeks as Laner and I charmed our way through court. I acquired 3 ladies-in-waiting, one from House Stokeworth and the 2 strong girls. The last 2 were odd in a way. I understood Lionel disdained mine and Alicent's games, preferring to focus on the practical sides of ruling a kingdom. As far as I understood, sending his daughters to me was less a show of support and more a way of saying that should my father die suddenly he would act in accordance with his wishes. Gods, I hope I can stop this guy from burning to death. Having Otto as hand when Viserys died would suck. Maria Stokeworth was a plump but pretty girl who fussed over everyone. I'd been enacting my Marjorie Tyrell-inspired plan to win over King's Landing by visiting a succession of orphanages when she'd entered my service, and I think it had awoken something in her. She'd begun organizing sewing rings and charity parties, chasing me to inquire as to whether I could help with funding. And since she was doing it in my name, well, Alicent wasn't too popular amongst the occupants of the city anymore. The 2 strong girls were called Alice and Sarah. Twins, they took more after Harwin than Lares physically. Both were pretty with the strong nose, their father's height and blue eyes, although thankfully, they didn't take after their older brother in attitude or intelligence. They weren't quite Lares levels of smart, but they were quick-witted at least and knew their manners. I suspected they were less thrilled by Maria's enforced sewing circles, but they went along with it well enough, preferring to spend their time sewing by sharing the sort of inside jokes that only twins had. Laner acquired a squire from House Rosby named Alton who he swore was a good lad at heart but had me half convinced he had nothing resembling a personality in the few brief times I'd met him. With both of us turning the charms on the court, the black faction went from strength to strength. The Wisdoms, under the watchful eye of Jarrett, left on a ship bearing my colors 2 weeks after Laner's meeting with them. I was given to understand that the competition for a place within the new campus had been fierce. The idea of these lost technologies had sent the guild into a frenzy. Jarrett had still been trying to insist the guild's true purpose was magic even as his co-workers fought over glass production techniques and knowledge of the nitrogen cycle. Viserys remained as spineless as ever, as predicted. Ser Cargill's report about Kristen's behavior did nothing after Alicent had stepped in on his behalf. I did manage to spend time with Helena after I all but petitioned Viserys in open court. Alicent had been sibling hoarding and coming up with excuse after excuse to not let me see any of them. I took the girl to the Dragon Pit for a ride on Syrax, which she'd talked about non-stop for 3 days. It was nice to be the big sister to a sibling that thought the world of you, and Alicent's twitching was just the cherry on the cake. Aegon, annoyingly, still avoided me like I had the plague when he could, and when he couldn't his interactions were icy, hostile but never outright rude. My one attempt to win Aemond over ended when he hit me in the shin with his wooden sword. It left a spectacular bruise and I was quite put out about it. Daeron remained pink, round and loud. As I approached the month mark, a cutter from Gulltown bearing Grafton colors arrived with a letter bearing the Arryn seal. Apparently, it would be impossible for me to meet with Jane right now as the Aerie had been sealed due to an outbreak of illness suspected to, from the way the letter writer described it, super plague. It had been signed by a Ser Arnold Arryn, keeper of the Gates of the Moon. Yeah, I was calling bullshit on that one. My wife is an enigma. Lena turned to him in surprise. They'd taken Seasmoke and Vagger to a deserted beach north of King's Landing and had been sitting watching the waves in silence for some time. Gods, he could see why his father hated King's Landing. I thought you liked her? She asked, one eyebrow raised. When he'd been young, he'd thought that he'd marry Lena. It hadn't been hard to imagine, she was his best friend. She already knew everything, he couldn't shame himself in front of her. She would have been happy with a husband that didn't try and prevent her from flying. I do. She just doesn't make sense, he finally replied. His sister huffed before scooping a rock from the sand and sending it flying into the waves. Lena did not see Rhaenyra like he did. She had been just 4 when they'd first met. Prince Baelon had died and Mother had told him that she was going to make him a king. He hadn't wanted to be a king, he'd wanted to fly Seasmoke and explore the world. He trailed about the Red Keep in misery until a small girl had ambushed him. 2 years his junior and already so much more worldly wise than him. They explored the tunnels together and afterwards his mother had scolded him for doing so, but he hadn't cared. Mother hadn't made him king or even an heir to one. He hadn't been allowed back to court and it was a decade before he saw her again. She'd flown to Driftmark atop Syrax and begged for Lady Rhaenys to protect her. She offered to marry him but Mother had been firm. She would not do anything to invite Viserys' wrath down on them. Rhaenyra had stayed for 2 weeks before her father summoned her back. She changed so much and in some ways not at all. She was still far more worldly wise than he could dream of being, with a smile that made it seem like she knew some kind of great secret no one else did. He'd thought he'd figured her out then. Why she'd been so afraid of Daemon? Why she'd sought him out as safe? He'd seen the way her eyes had moved to track his sister as she'd danced with his father's bannermen and captains. When they'd been betrothed he'd assumed she'd find her own lover amongst her ladies and he'd have Joffrey, and at some point she'd find someone suitable to bear their heirs. He'd told her as much as they'd sat on the bed after the wedding, but she'd rebuked him. She'd told him they could not risk bastards, not with the queen waiting for any slip-up, not with Corlys watching them so closely. He'd panicked and tipped off his father by spending too much time at Driftmark. He'd been too heartsick at losing Joffrey and too terrified of the shame that would accompany Rhaenyra's realization that he couldn't produce an heir with her. Father had made his play and he'd found his understanding of his wife thrown again. He'd always thought she was epitome of a princess. That she practiced alchemy and had brought no ladies, no lords and no support to Dragonstone had shocked him. Father had said that her obsession with whatever she was making would destroy her chances at the throne and had told Laenor he would ensure the whole alchemy business was finished with. That he would take a firm hand with the Blacks so that he could protect the rights of his unborn grandchildren. Mother had been little help, she had been weary of father's methods, but she'd agreed Rhaenyra needed to be reined in. She'd told him to bed her and bed her well. That she'd fall in line once she was married woman in truth. He'd asked his mother if she'd fallen in line with his father after being bedded and she'd sent him to his room like an errant child and not the man of 20 that he was. She thought that any child of King Viserys was soft, like he was. Don't misunderstand me, Laenor, I love the girl but she needs someone strong in her life, his mother had told him. How wrong they were, how little they understood. At least he knew just how little he knew about her. He'd thought her attracted to women, but after watching her for the past few months he'd begun noticing something odd. Her eyes flickered to women as if she couldn't help herself, but sometimes, if she wasn't aware she was being watched, her mask would slip and she would look disappointed. As if she had been expecting something from them that hadn't been delivered. Men, himself included, had also provided a similarly puzzling reaction. When she allowed herself to look at them he could see the lust in her face and afterwards, she always looked vaguely unsettled. He'd prodded Joffrey into revealing that she had taken no lover in the 6 months they'd been apart. No man or woman had graced her bed, only books on such a wide range of subjects that many joked that she wished to become the first female maester as well as first queen. And then there was the book. She was lying to him about it being a copy of a copy of a copy. She was lying about it being a relic from her childhood. He did not know why, but he knew his wife had created these things. The manner of speech the author employed was too much like the manner of speech she herself used when she slipped. He'd heard too many of the strange words and phrases that peppered the text from his wife before the pages had come to light to believe that she'd last read it during her childhood. Why would she not tell him she had written it? Oh. Speak of her and she will come, came his sister's voice, interrupting his musings. He followed her gaze to the rapidly approaching form of Syrax. They hauled themselves up from the sand and did their best to brush themselves clear as Rhaenyra steered her mount in for landing. He knew something was wrong from the way she strode over the sand towards them. Oh, this doesn't look good. Have you angered her brother? Mumbled Lena. He didn't have time to reply as Rhaenyra reached them a moment later and waved an envelope bearing the Arryn seal at them. Lena took it as his wife caught her breath. He watched as she read through it and paled. There is some sort of plague in the Vale. The Eyrie has been sealed, his sister stated, handing him the letter. He felt his heart sink. Rhaenyra had been so sure her cousin was in their corner. He had no idea who the heir to the Vale of Arryn was, but he suspected they'd drive a much harder bargain for support than Rhaenyra's own flesh and blood. It's a lie. There is no plague. It was stated with such anger and finality. Baffled, he risked a glance at his sister, only see she'd done the same thing. Look at the signature on the letter, she growled. He did so. Ser Arnold Arryn, Keeper of the Gates of the Moon. He is Jane's closest male relative. If women are excluded from inheritance, then he is the man who inherits. The damn thing came on a ship in Grafton colors. You believe he's lying? That this is a plot against Lady Jane? He asked. Rhaenyra nodded, eyes bright with fury. She was so certain. Why was she so certain? What did she know? If you're wrong, you risk allowing the Vale to be decimated by plague, his sister pointed out. He watched his wife's jaw clench and the fingers on her right hand flex. An old injury, a parting gift from the uncle that had terrified her so. What had Daemon done that she ran from him when she wouldn't even bow in the face of plague? I am not wrong. There is no plague in the Vale, I would know if there was. He took a deep breath and made a decision. Lena, could you stay here and reassure the Black Lords in our absence? It seems Rhaenyra and I will be traveling to the Vale to discover the truth of it. Plague in the Vale, my ass. I know there's no plague in the Vale, just like I know that Ser Arnold is a dirty lying liar who's probably got Jane locked up somewhere whilst he brings the Vale Lords to his side. Maybe I was overreacting, history tells me he probably won't succeed, but hopefully flying to Jane's aid would ingratiate me much further than words on paper. There was also the more selfish idea of that if, somehow, I had butterflied him into succeeding, then he would never support me. If he did, he made his own claim on the Vale invalid. I wanted to push the dragons hard, but Laenor had counseled caution. He'd told me that if we pushed the dragons too hard they'd be in no condition to fight once we did reach the Vale. If I was right about Ser Arnold, then we couldn't take that risk. We had no clue how he was maintaining control currently, Laenor told me. He could have fooled the Vale Lords like he'd try to fool me, or be perched in the gates of the moon with a massive army. I'd accepted, grudgingly. This meant that instead of blurring past the fields of the Crownlands and the Riverlands rolled by at a much more sedate pace. The trip took 4 days at the almost agonizingly slow pace Laenor had set. We'd stopped the night at Duskendale, Maidenpool and the Salt Pans. Luckily, the lords of those towns had understood that we were in a hurry and could not afford to engage in the lavish feasts that hosts were expected to throw when royalty came calling. Or maybe they were simply relieved we weren't insisting on slowly bankrupting them with our presence. We'd have to come back later and make a show of it. I could not afford to offend or alienate House Darklyn, House Mouton, and House Cox. Or rather I could, but that thinking was likely to lead to a disaster sooner or later, being too close to the original Rhaenyra's, I am heir, bow to me attitude that had lost her the dance. I found it hard to sleep as we made our way across Westeros, too strung out on thoughts of somehow butterflying Jane's hold on the Vale away. We reached the Bloody Gate itself in the late evening and made the decision to bypass it entirely, to fly onward to the Gates of the Moon. The dragons would cover the distance with ease and I couldn't face another night of wondering if I'd messed up somehow. Had the original Rhaenyra shown more support? Had I failed to gain a supporter in the Vale that backed Jane? My thoughts swirled like that as we soared through the air. Then they ceased as I beheld the Eyrie for the first time. I found myself forced to gape at the seat of House Arryn, struck dumb by the sheer impossibility of it. 7 white towers atop a colossal mountain, surrounded by more mountains on either side and long winding road as the only approach. Stylish, impossible to siege and all but practically screamed I rule, you don't now grovel, to any who beheld it. It made the Red Keep look like some newly made knight's Mott and Bailey by comparison. No wonder cousin Jane had been so proud of it. After Laenor and I finished marveling over the local architecture we took the dragons in for landing at the Gates of the Moon, ensuring we came down in front of the castle. Inside we would be surrounded at least this way, we wouldn't have men at our backs. Dragons were vulnerable when they were on the ground in a way they simply were not in the air. Hardened scales that flexed when they breathed exposed the soft flesh beneath, impossible to hit whilst they flew but a valid target for spears and swords when forced to land. The Gates of the Moon did not quite match the Eyrie in beauty, but they were still worthy of note. Beautiful but practical, no army was getting past it without the castle's express permission. The first way stop for any visitor to the Eyrie and the first line of defense if the Eyrie ever came under attack. It also served as the seat of House Arryn during the winter, which is why the title of Keeper was non-hereditary and normally given to someone within the Arryn family. Someone who could be trusted to remain loyal. We were greeted by knights in the Arryn livery. They streamed from the open portcullis and formed a loose semicircle around our mounts, and my suspicions regarding the nature of the plague were only reinforced by their nervous demeanor, the way they weren't sure if they would soon need to draw weapons. I let Laenor do the talking as my eyes searched the battlements. More men in Arryn livery dotted it, but I spotted the odd flash of Grafton colors. Ho there, I am Ser Laenor Velaryon, with me is Her Grace Princess Rhaenyra, heir to the Iron throne, he called. There was flurry of activity and then a handsome older man that could only be Sir Arnold Aaron strode out, waving his men to stand down. He had the classic Aaron look both my mother and Jane bore. The sandy blonde hair and blue eyes that denoted their prized undull heritage. He was clean-shaven with shoulder-length hair worn in a knot, and for all that he'd arranged his features into a pleasant smile, a life of court had taught me to spot the subtle signs of stress. The darkened eyes showing a lack of sleep, the tense way he held his shoulders, this guy was on the edge. Your Grace. I am Sir Arnold Aaron, Keeper of the Gates of the Moon, not for much longer if you've done anything to my cousin. I am happy to receive you and offer you guest right, but I must warn you dash. We are aware of the rumors of plague within the Vale. It was my hope to somehow ascertain if my cousin was well, I called. In the dimming light, I could see the indecision writ clear on his face. He could not prevent me from flying up the mountain if I so wished, but if he was lying about the plague, I would soon know. Therefore he needed me to get gone as soon as possible, and I just made it clear that I thought his claims of illness were just that, claims. The fact that neither of us had moved to dismount our dragons, the only creature currently able to completely nullify the advantage the men of the Vale took pride in, must also factor in to his decisions. I risked a glance at the battlements once more. More Grafton men and considerably more ranged weaponry now. He was stalling, but even he knew he could not get away with murdering a Targaryen princess and her consort, if he were even capable of it. I could not in good conscience allow you to do that, Your Grace. It is my duty to contain the plague here if the whole of the Vale of Arryn is not to be ravaged by it. I clenched my jaw at the word allow. He would allow me nothing. Tell me, Sir Aaron, how did the plague come to be in the Eyrie? I note a lot of Grafton men here, perhaps it came through Gulltown. Laenor pointed out, and I watched as Sir Arnold shifted, hand falling to his hilt as he licked his lips. Probably wondering if his men could bring us down before we melt his castle down around his ears. I didn't pay attention to his response, I was watching the Grafton men. They were agitated. Clearly fighting two dragons hadn't been on their to-do list this morning, and they were close to breaking. Either one would take a pot shot at us and the rest would follow, or they would run. I couldn't risk an arrow storm. I shifted in my saddle, urging Syrax to turn her gaze to the battlements. If Sir Aaron noticed, he didn't break from his long-winded explanation about the nature of the illness, the one Laenor was pretending to be enraptured by. I felt her tense under me as she sensed the fight coming. I loosened the whip at my side and focused on the battlements again. Having a dragon actually looking at them was doing wonders for their sudden sense of mortality. Something just a little more direct then. Dracaries. Syrax let forth a gout of flame that missed everyone standing on the battlements but ensured they all felt the heat of it. Panicked men threw down their weapons and fled, screaming. The knights that had met us outside the gate charged forward with shouts. I heard Laenor's whip crack and sea smoke lurched forward and incinerated half of them at once. The rest fled. Sir Arnold Aaron hadn't moved, hadn't even drawn his sword, and I could see the fury on his face. He knew he was beaten, knew the Vale was beyond his reach now, and he knew I made that happen. I flashed him a sweet smile that evolved into a smirk of satisfaction as the gates of the moon exploded into chaos behind him, his men giving calls of retreat with no thought to whether he still lived. Evidently as loyal to him as they'd been to Jane. That would teach him to rely on traitors and men easily bought. They found it so easy to do so once again. Keep an eye on him, Laenor. I'm going to see if Lady Arryn is well, I ordered in a tone that promised dire retribution if she were not for any reason. Laenor nodded, not taking his eyes off the Arryn knight. The look on his face suggested he'd be quite happy for Sir Arnold to make his move, if only for sea smoke to have a chance at eating him. A light tap of the whip and Syrax took me upwards and over the wall. After the gates of the moon there were 3 more waycastles a would-be besieger would have to get around before assaulting the Eyrie proper. Below me, the first waycastle, Stone, was silent and dark as the grave. Had the men of the garrison betrayed Jane, or had they been killed when Sir Arnold had launched his coup? Syrax shifted underneath me and then snarled. I squinted at the mountain path, but could make nothing out. Had she seen something? Dragons had good eyesight, even in the dark that had fallen around us. Actually, that was not strictly true. Dragons are terribly long-sighted. They could spot a rabbit racing through scrub land from the air, but put that rabbit in front of them and they'd be snuffling around for it for a while. Perhaps she'd heard something then. Another sense the dragon excelled at. Had she heard soldiers on the mountain perhaps? I was getting distracted, the adrenaline making it hard to focus on one thing for long. In comparison to stone, snow was alive with activity. At the sight of Syrax, men scrambled into action. I couldn't see precisely what they were doing, but I could see fires winking out and get a general sense of frantic activity. When I reached Sky, I didn't need Syrax's super hearing to hear the unusual response. The normal response to a dragon appearing the sky above your castle was fear and screaming, not the cheering of the men of the Sky Garrison. I smiled to myself. They must be Jane's men, and nothing cheers the spirits like realizing you had a dragon your side. I swooped in low to more cheering before flying on the Aerie proper. The fact that they had still been holding out suggested that Jane was still okay. Ser Arnold was her heir, technically, and if she'd died it would have given those men a legitimate reason to surrender lawfully. After all, fighting to defend a castle from the person who now owned it was not something anyone in Westeros would approve of. The Aerie had clearly not been built with dragons in mind. Syrax was just able to fit on the widest part of the approach to the main gate. I hopped off with less grace than I had hoped to convey and pulled my cloak tightly around my shoulders to ward against the chill. The moment I was fully away, Syrax took to the air once more and flew towards a smaller peak that the Aerie overlooked. I made my way to the gate. As I got closer I could make out shouts and activity from beyond it. Specks of light from torches flickered back and forth. By the time I'd actually reached them, they'd begun to swing open. More Aaron Knights were there, flanking Jane. She was thinner than when I'd last seen her and her eyes spoke of too much missed sleep, but she was smiling widely. "Cousin. I sent you a letter but I fear it never made it through," I called. She laughed, although I could tell it was strained, more from surprise and relief than any true humor. I crossed the threshold of the gate and pulled her into a hug. She stiffened slightly before relaxing and returning it. "Thank you for coming, cousin. How do you like the Aerie?" she chuckled. Things moved quickly after the siege was broken. At the sight of the dragon the besiegers had turned tail and fled, disorganized as they were. It was unlikely they'd threaten the Aerie again. The loyal Aaron men had been all too happy to chase in any case, just to make sure. Laenor personally bore Ser Arnold to the Aerie where Jane had him locked in the sky cells. His men were quick to start throwing blame around, with most blaming the Graftons for the attempted coup. As I stood beside Jane as she handed out judgment, I began to get an idea of what had occurred and how truly devious Ser Arnold had been. In his position of Keeper of the Gates of the Moon he'd begun subverting Jane's guards and had been doing since the old Lord Royce had appointed him to the position a decade earlier. He'd quietly sought aid from other houses in the Vale and had received it from a Grafton Knight in return for the promise of a marriage to Ser Arnold's children. This Grafton Knight, Ser Roland, had apparently been responsible for providing most of the muscle Ser Arnold had been relying on. Using Roland's supposed mastery of Gulltown he'd brought in mercenaries under Lord Grafton's nose and had hidden them within the gates. Roland's Grafton men had positioned themselves nearby and awaited the signal. He'd expected to announce his claim, march up the mountain and be admitted to the Aerie through a show of force. To improve his odds he'd placed men inside the Aerie with orders to demoralize the defenders and try their best to sabotage the defense. When the jaws of his trap closed, more men than expected stayed loyal to Jane and his march had floundered halfway up the mountain, leaving him with no choice but to battle the rest of the way. Even though his plan was, quite frankly, completely delusional, it seemed he'd had some sense. His first victim had been Jane's maester, cutting her off from calling for aid. Other victims of his hidden men were older sergeants and men-at-arms who were in positions of command. Even though she couldn't call for aid, he'd still been pushed for time. He'd claimed the Aerie was suffering from sickness to cover his crime, but the nobility of the Vale would investigate eventually. According to those of his men we'd captured, he'd been getting desperate. For good reason, as it turned out. 3 days after we had relieved the siege on the Aerie, a small army of about 2,000 under the command of Lord Dennis Waynwood and Lord Gerald Redfort arrived and demanded that Ser Arnold Arryn turn over command of the Gates of the Moon to them or face siege. That honorless dash. Lord Redfort shouted as Jane summarized Arnold's uprising and defeat. Next to him, his daughter looked ready to march to the sky cells herself and engage in some egregious violations of prisoner rights. Dearest companion, indeed. Both Redforts had dark hair and dark eyes, although Lord Gerald's was streaked with silver. He had short hair for a noble but made up for it with a long beard he evidently took a lot of pride in, if the amount of grooming and braiding that went into it was any indication. Jessamine Redfort was pretty enough, although no real beauty by the standards of the realm, even if I felt a bit harsh in that judgment. I'd quickly learned she was quick-witted though and fun to speak with. We were seated in Jane's solar, sipping wine. Laner had decided to take the opportunity to show everyone he could fight and had joined the loyal Eren men to hunt for any lingering Grafton forces and hopefully head off the banditry that usually accompanied several thousand men finding themselves jobless and in possession of arms and armor. I'd tried to persuade him not to take sea smoke, but he'd pointed out that the lords of Westeros already muttered about his prowess with the sword. If we meant to put a stop to any rumors, he would need to prove his martial ability without his dragon backing him up. He was right, but I couldn't get past visions of his pointless death in taking a needless risk. I'd gotten revenge by making a show of it as they departed. I'd presented him with my favor before ordering him, loudly, to come back to me unharmed before pulling him in for a kiss. According to Jane, her people found it sweet that we were so in love. Please, Lord Gerald. I am unharmed and he is in the sky cells. The men he hired fled in the face of my cousin's arrival and will likely not stop fleeing until they reach the narrow sea, said Jane soothingly. Lord Gerald didn't reply but took a long drink of his wine. Jessamine Redfort leant forward and placed a hand on Jane's arm. Jane covered it with a hand of her own and gave her a small smile. Lord Dennis cleared his throat and the attention of the room moved to him. He was monstrously tall and half as wide across with long blonde hair he wore in a braid and a clean-shaven jaw that looked as if he could kill a man with it. For all that he looked like a bruiser, he'd been among the first to figure out Ser Arnold's scheme and had been the one who'd recruited Lord Redfort into his rescue. He was a lot more intelligent than he looked and someone to be weary of. We, of course, thank her grace for her assistance, but the fact remains that there are still Grafton men out there who struck against you. That includes Ser Roland, and I know Gulltown well enough that he could not have done it without the support of Lord Humphrey, he said. You wish for me to strike at the Graftons? You believe Ser Roland a patsy and Lord Humphrey the true mastermind, Jane stated. It makes sense, I said. Ser Arnold's plan was equal parts brilliant and delusional. It speaks of two minds. And I've met Ser Roland. He hasn't the brains or the wits for this, said Lord Dennis pointed out. Jane placed her wine down and folded her hands beneath her chin. I cannot punish Lord Humphrey with no proof as to whether he was involved. I do not have the support. The lords may tolerate me, but they will not tolerate striking at one of their number without undeniable proof of wrongdoing, she said, quietly. Nonsense. Those were Grafton men with Ser Arnold and mercenaries brought in via Gulltown. If Lord Humphrey did not know, he is incompetent, and if he did, he is complicit. No lord would question you in this. At Lord Gerald's outburst, Jane leant back and massaged her temples before grimacing. Cousin, you have 2 dragons at your immediate disposal. You have 2 more that can be summoned within a week or 2. You have the support of Lord Redfort and Lord Waynwood. If you don't move now, they will continue to ferment rebellion in the Vale, I urged, seeing that she was wavering. Even if I did strike at Lord Grafton, what would you have me do? Cut his head off. His sons would be at the head of the next rebellion with half the Vale likely at their backs, she snapped before sighing and closing her eyes. Lord Dennis huffed in annoyance. Seize Gulltown, I replied. Jane's eyes blinked open and she stared at me incredulously. Are you mad? Even if your dragons swing the fight, we could not take it without burning the town first. And if we do take it, burned or not, I could not hold it. She cried. Every eye in the room was staring at me in surprise. I sighed. From what I could remember, the Graftons remained a problem for the Arryns well into the canon timeline. Getting rid of them now could only strengthen Jane's hold over the Vale. Selfishly, of course, it would also make trading with her easier when the time came to begin developing Dragonstone in earnest. That could work, said Jessamine Redfort slowly. Jane just shook her head as if she'd just noticed everyone around her had gone mad and she was still sane. Explain, said her father. The Arryns of Gulltown. The Lannisters have the Lannisters of Lannisport, why not ennoble the Arryns of Gulltown? Their legitimacy would come from Jane, and they'd have an easier time of holding the city because they have history there and an existing rapport with the citizens. And nobody is going to follow them if they did rebel because their line is bunch of coin counters, added Lord Gerald, a large and nasty grin growing over his face. Then he stood and pulled his daughter into a crushing hug. I found myself blinking in surprise. That had gone down better than expected, even if Jane was still looking at father and daughter as if she were waiting for someone to shout, "Fooled you." You are aware, of course, that if we intend to take the city without 2 dragons reducing it to cinders, we will need the aid of Lady Royce, Lord Dennis pointed out. It was hard to tell who took this worse, myself or Jane. I felt the blood drain from my face as I realized just who he meant by Lady Royce. Lady Rhea Royce, the current wife of Prince Daemon Targaryen. Opposite me, Jane's face had gone an angry red and her jaw clenched. Did Jane not defend Rhea's lands against Daemon in canon? What had happened that would get this reaction from her? No. No. I will not ask that. I will not. She stood, hands clenched. Pardon, but what is the problem with enlisting my lady aunt? I asked, hoping the lords had been too interested in Jane's outburst to note my reaction. Jane flung herself into the chair. Jessamine sat next to her and leant close, murmuring words of reassurance that did little to soften the angry glare etched into Jane's face. Lady Royce's father was Hubert Royce, Jane's regent, during her minority, explained Lord Gerald with a sigh. He seized power. He made me a prisoner in my own castle. He sent away my ladies. He tried to marry me to his son. He used my name to marry his daughter to a prince. I blinked at Jane's outburst. She was standing again and looking ready to attack someone. Jessamine was pulling at her dress, trying to calm her. Lord Dennis merely sighed. It is true that Lord Royce greatly overstepped the boundaries of what is considered appropriate as a regent. There were talks to have him replaced when he was killed alongside his sons, said Lord Gerald as Jane was guided back into her seat. Lady Royce has proved to be a loyal vassal devoid of her father's ambition. In fact, I would hazard a guess that she resents it as it was the cause of her rather unfortunate marriage. She is quite happy to stay at Runestone and rule, supplied Lord Dennis. He would know, I suppose. His lands bordered Lady Rhea's, so he likely saw her more than any other noble in the Vale, barring her vassals. Did she ride to my aid? Snapped Jane, irritably. Don't be boneheaded, Jane. Lady Royce could have ridden to your defense on the back of a griffin and you would have found fault, came Jessamine's equally waspish reply. Oh gods, these two are less subtle than Laenor. How are they getting away with it? Jane, if you allow the Graftons to get away with this, others in the Vale will wonder what they can get away with. If they see you, Royce, Redfort and Waynwood united with royal backing, they'll think twice about any future rebellion, I pointed out. Jane's face twisted in fury. Fine, she spat. We will ride to Runestone and pick up more Redfort and Waynwood troops on the way. I will sanction the seizure of Gulltown if Lady Rhea will add her strength to ours. Only if she agrees to add her strength to ours. Apparently sensing that was the best they were going to get, we moved on to other topics. Lord Dennis and Lord Gerald were obviously angling for a reward of some kind, but apparently my arrival rendered their own rescue pointless, so Jane was able to duck it a little. She agreed to take Jessamine Redfort as a lady-in-waiting, and I'd had to force myself not to cackle as she acted like it was some great honor and not a foregone conclusion. Also, were Vale lords blind? Because Jane was giving the Redfort girl major hard eyes and Lord Dennis and Lord Gerald seemed to have just not noticed. Doing my part for my cousin, I agreed to take Felena Waynwood with me back to the capital to join my growing pool of ladies-in-waiting. Lord Dennis assured me she wasn't the type to easily frighten and could be trusted amongst the various factions at court, but I resolved to ensure that for myself before I let her in on any secrets. Although, to be fair, all of my new ladies-in-waiting were untested. Their fathers may be blacks, but history was littered with children that did not wish to follow their parents' plans for them. More work for Joffrey, I suppose. If I'd been under any illusions about how fast Jane's makeshift army was going to travel now that we had a firm goal in mind, they were shattered within the first week. First we had to wait for the hunting parties to return. Laenor came back with them unharmed and had apparently impressed a fair few of the knights that had accompanied him. A knight of House Harding named John had especially taken a shine to him, and I suspected Laenor might have an admirer. Although given the looks Laenor was shooting right back, the feeling was very much mutual. Once Jane had made sure the land surrounding the area was devoid of any lurking armies to put it under siege again, she moved on to scouring her garrison for any hint of treachery. The woman was relentless, and she ended up dismissing a fair few knights and servants when the answers they gave regarding where their allegiances lay weren't satisfactory. I did manage to secure an hour or two for her, Laenor, Jessamine and I to sit down and discuss the future of the Vale and the Black faction at court. Which was no easy feat given her dedication to ensuring Ser Arnold could never, ever subvert her people again. I was beginning to suspect a few of neuroses there. She had definitely not taken the threat on her home well. You believe Alicent will escalate then? Asked my cousin, studying me with a curious intensity. I had thought her goal to be forcing your father to disavow you as his heir via political pressure from his lords. It will not work. father is probably the most stubborn man in all of the 7 kingdoms. I do not know why he refused to acknowledge Aegon as his heir after he was born, but now it is too late for either of us to back down. When father dies I will make my claim because to do otherwise is death, and Alicent will make her claim because otherwise the Hightowers will lose a vast amount of resources and prestige. I replied. Jane nodded thoughtfully. You have our complete support, cousin, but we are not exactly the Reach when it comes to what we can provide. Meaning her pockets weren't endless or deep and she had a serious manpower problem. Luckily, Laenor and I could help with that. I glanced at Laenor, who nodded and leant forward. I had been quite surprised to learn that during his time with the Vale Knights he'd been paying attention to just what they were saying regarding the problems the Vale had. He'd returned with several ideas on how our technology could be used to strengthen and develop our allies beyond the obvious in the farming technology. The fact that I had convinced Jane to seize Gulltown for House Arryn, albeit a distant branch of it, had thrilled him. Apparently gaining a greater control of the port was something he'd been intending to advise Jane to do. Rhaenyra and I have begun working on developing technologies from an ancient book, he began. What does that actually mean? Asked Jessamine, derailing his spiel. He paused, trying to explain, and I took pity. Processes, devices, new ways of doing things. The book is a copy of a copy and so on. It will require intense study, but already we have a wealth of new ideas to work with, I told her. Laenor nodded along. You would strengthen the Vale in return for me aiding you against Alicent and her Greens, stated Jane. Wisdom Jarrett estimates that if we managed to reproduce even half of the technology mentioned we could increase crop yields by 9 times, and that's a conservative estimate. That is just what the book says regarding agriculture, Laenor pointed out. There's more than just agriculture? Asked Jane. When Laenor nodded, Jessamine let out an impressed whistle and turned to Jane with wide eyes. You know that I would support you regardless of whether you gave me this information, Rhaenyra, but I will not lie and say that I do not want access to what you develop from this book, Jane said after a moment's pause. As Laenor said, we want to help develop the Vale. Yet we should also look to see how we can develop it in other ways. The research on the book has only just started, after all. Do you know whether the Vale can support mines? I asked. Jessamine giggle-snorted in a weird cross between amusement and frustration. Jane shot her a dry look. The Vale does support mines currently. Mostly in Royce lands in the form of copper and tin, which shouldn't be surprising. I mine most of the marble and I believe the Belmores have a small iron mine, she said after Jessamine had calmed down. Oh, I see. It's the mountain clans, isn't it? Said Laenor before I could ask her to clarify why there was so little mining when you would assume the mountains would hold a wealth of resources. Correct. The mountains are rich with silver, iron and even some deposits of gold. Oh, don't get me wrong, it's nothing compared to Casterly Rock, but it's still a good amount. The problem is where it's located. Any permanent presence is either overrun before we can pull anything significant out of it or requires so much men to guard it that the mines simply aren't economical. Honestly, most houses of the Vale have given up ever mining the resources of the mountains, Jane told him. Ouch. The lords of the Vale were a proud lot but poor. To know there was a king's ransom sitting in the mountains they were so proud of and also know it's completely untouchable must rankle. Then if we intend to help we have to start with the mountain clans, I said. This time both Jane and Jessamine laughed, but it was bitter. You think we have not tried? They know the mountains better than we do. Thousands of men can completely vanish and any attempt to chase them, even with vast armies or mounted knights, are doomed to failure, said Jane finally. We must settle for hunting them every autumn and depriving them of resources that way. I gritted my teeth. Perhaps I could kill 2 birds with 1 stone here. My new pike and shot model army was dead in the water, but I didn't have to give up on the idea of a professional army loyal to the crown. My entire knowledge of warfare came from playing copious amounts of Total War games, but even I knew that relying on vassals for the majority of your muscle was a very bad idea. The mountain clans had to be dealt with if the Vale was going to be strong enough to help win me the dance. They were a nuisance that in the right circumstances could turn themselves into a disaster, but they also presented an opportunity. During canon the mountain clans had served Tyrion. They'd hunted Stannis scouts with a ruthless efficiency, blinding him to Tywin and the Reach's approach until it was too late. The mountain clans would not work for me, I was under no illusions about that. I could, however, train my own versions with better equipment and supplies and use the Mountains of the Moon as their crucible. If it succeeded, I would have a reliable force that could blind my enemies to my movements and raid their supply lines, and if it didn't, I had still sent aid to Jane and would won some goodwill from her. You've had a thought, said Laner, looking at me. I recognized that smirk. Was I smirking? Yes. I explained the idea to the three of them without the bit about Tyrion. The clans know the mountains better than any men you can send, and they move about them with little to no effort. You will be sending them to their deaths. Even if you manage to find clan territory, they'd simply pick up and move. I'm not suggesting we throw them into a search and destroy action straight away. I'd suggest they arrive, set up some sort of fort and slowly explore first, learned he mountains. Then we use them in addition to whatever men your lords can raise to put the mountain clans to flight in a true campaign. Jane, it's worth a try. Even if it only succeeds for a season or two, it's enough to create and reinforce some minds. You said yourself that something needed to change in the Vale, said Jessamine, softly. Jane sighed, melting in the face of her lover's pleading look. Rhaenyra, you seem to have kicked over an anthill. Very well, if the business with Gulltown doesn't explode in our faces, I will put it to my lords for their opinions. Seven knows it will at least give them something to do. It was still another week until we left the Eyrie. An undercurrent of unease and excitement seemed to be boiling under the skin of every man and woman making the journey. Things were changing in the Vale. Word had gotten out the Graftons had earned Lady Erin's ire to the point that she was willing to seek Lady Royce's aid, which did not point to good things in Lord Humphrey Grafton's future. Going to war, even a minor one like this, was not as glamorous or fun as I'd hoped. Progress was achingly slow, and a trip that Syrax could have made in less than half a day and one man on a horse could make in 2 days took us 4 whole days. Admittedly, the road was poor and the terrain hard to pass. Jane promised that we would make better time on the road from Iron Oaks to Runestone as it was on flatter land. Road being a generous term for the glorified dirt track that occasionally lead into steep rises over rock. We stayed a few days in Iron Oaks as more men joined us from houses sworn to Lord Dennis and Lord Gerald before setting off for Runestone proper, a trip that promised to cost us another week in time. I was told Jane had sent word to Lady Rhea informing her of our coming, but there had been no reply waiting at Iron Oaks for us. Jane sulked about the whole matter the entire way and refused even Jessamine's cajoling to cheer up. Happily, Felena Waynwood appeared to be made of sterner stuff than most. We'd picked her up during our brief stay at Iron Oaks and she seemed completely unfazed by Syrax, the marching or the fact that Laner was being as unsubtle as a brick to the face when it came to Ser John. I still wasn't ready to trust her completely, but it seemed she knew how to keep her mouth shut so far. It was getting towards evening when we finally caught sight of Runestone. A respectable stone keep that towered over a cliff, looking out over the sea. Probably had some really nice views, but I'm also willing to bet no one ever told them about erosion. Actually, maybe I was wrong about that. Part of the cliff had fallen away due to time and the sea, but the land that supported the castle seemed untouched. A mystery for another day, I suppose. Lady Rhea and her household were waiting to greet us. My lady aunt was a tall woman with dark hair and hazel eyes. Her thin lips were being forced to form a polite smile, but I could tell she was completely unimpressed with our arrival. We left the army setting up camp outside Runestone proper alongside Syrax and Seasmoke and accompanied the more distinguished members of our party to meet with Lady Royce. It was awkward, and the whole business did not get any less awkward as we proceeded inside and were invited to share a small meal. Jane barely managed to stay on the right side of polite, a fact I attribute entirely to Jessamine's hasty diplomacy. For her own part, Lady Rhea ignored Jane's comments and muttering, instead focusing on her meal like she was trying to ignore our presence. Lord Dennis and Lord Gerald were not willing to let her forget though, and had already started putting pressure on Rhea to help us against the Graftons, heedless of the tense mood. Rhea was as non-committal as possible but did agree to arrange a proper discussion regarding the matter. Honestly, to say the Royces supposedly had a blood feud going on with the Graftons, she was surprisingly ambivalent about the prospect of finally getting rid of them. I probably should have taken that as a warning that she was preoccupied by something else completely. Me, namely. I'd barely gotten to the rooms assigned to me when one of her servants materialized and asked me if I'd like to join Lady Rhea in her solar for some wine. Princess Rhaenyra, I did not expect to see you riding to my liege lady's aid. I must offer you my thanks for defending the Vale from such treachery. For all that her words were praise, her tone was ice cold. I offered her a warm smile and frantically tried to think of whatever I did that would have pissed her off this badly. I'd last seen her in person 12 years ago, and even then it had been a quick meet and greet. I'd gotten Daemon banished, but again, that was hardly something she would be upset about given the way he'd treated her over the years. Thank you, Lady Rhea. My cousin is dear to me, I would not see her harmed, I replied. That should be safe enough. Ria regarded me with a cool look before waving a servant forth to pour wine. I wondered briefly if it could be poisoned before dismissing the thought. Ria wasn't nearly stupid enough to poison the heir to the Iron Throne in her own keep whilst an army and 2 dragons were camped outside. Dear to you? Or dear to the blacks? Ria asked after she'd taken a sip. Okay, maybe she just doesn't like me bringing my little private war to the Vale and especially to her doorstep. To be truthful, both, but she is my cousin first. Besides, we women need to stick together, I replied before taking a drink. Honesty seemed to be the best policy with Ria. Oh. Were we sticking together when you fucked my husband? If you like this content, don't forget to like and subscribe. See you later, bye bye.